Welcome back. So today we're going to shift gears a little bit. We spent the last few chapters looking at the elements and principles of design. We were looking at the way artists arrange these different parts, these different elements and principles into a coherent image. Now we're going to explore what artists create art objects with and the various materials and methods by which they make art. So today we're going to start with the simplest of all of what we call the media, and that's what we call anything, any material that an artist uses is the media, or the medium, singular, is we're going to explore drawing media. So let's just jump right in, guys. So drawing is defined as a depiction of shapes and forms on a surface, primarily by means of lines. So drawing is linear, meaning it's related to lines. It provides a primal outlet for artistic energy and ideas. It's a basis of all visual communication. Drawing is a fundamental skill. It's really difficult to be an artist without some sort of basic knowledge of drawing, and it's used to some degree in every artistic medium. Artists draw for many reasons, of course, to create. So it's an end to itself, but also often as a plan to prepare for other works. Now, you guys just watched a video about Leonardo da Vinci, so you're already familiar with him somewhat. So, Leonardo da Vinci is an excellent example of this. He often would use drawings as a way to sort of shape ideas and to plan for other works. This is not uncommon. If paint is expensive, and if artists are going to create a large-scale work, they often create small-scale drawings, oftentimes many, sometimes hundreds of them, in preparation of larger-scale works. In much the same way that an architect will create a blueprint before constructing a building. Now, before I get too further into this, I want to talk about sort of drawings, sort of reputation in the art world. If you go to a museum, you're going to see a lot of paintings and sculptures, but you won't see nearly as many drawings. And the reason for this is because drawings have, I won't say a stigma, but certainly drawings aren't considered by many to be as important of an art form as painting and sculpture and some of these other materials, photography. Partially because I think drawing is cheap. Anybody can get hold of a pencil and a piece of paper. Drawing is something that anybody can do, maybe not do well, but drawing is something that we've all done literally since we were children. And so there's this kind of stigma against drawing, that it's not as good as or as important as other kinds of materials. And also the fact that drawing is often used in preparation, used as a way for artists to hash out or work out ideas, or a way for artists to lay out a work like a painting later on. Then also this gives this sort of second-class citizen kind of feeling to the material of drawing. And I think that is unfair because drawing requires a lot of skill. For me, drawing is like the base skill. And if you really want to see how technically proficient an artist is, well, you make them draw a picture. Because the materials being so simple, I require, in a way, a lot more skill than maybe some more elaborate advanced techniques. Okay, that's just my own opinion. So as you know from Leonardo, though, this is a guy who drew a lot. And in fact, as you probably learned in the video, Leonardo only created somewhere around a dozen or so completed paintings in his, as you can see here, rather long career. But what he did, what he produced most of, were thousands of drawings. And some of these drawings are very famous in their own right, like his image here of Vitruvian Man, a sort of exploration of geometric concepts by this Roman architectural architect and theorist, a guy named Vitruvius, who was sort of obsessed with perfect proportions and the perfect proportions of the square and the circle. And Leonardo da Vinci was trying to show sort of the perfection of man by putting him in a square and a circle. And he worked out these ideas in the form of a drawing. And he filled his notebooks with thousands of these explorations. Leonardo was voracious in his desire to learn about nature, about science, about engineering. And Leonardo always said, and he says this in his books about painting, that if you really want to understand how to paint a good picture, you have to understand the world that you're painting. So to paint, if you want to paint a convincing smile, you have to understand how the muscles make that smile happen. Or if you want to paint a perfect cloud, then you have to understand how the raindrops coalesce in the atmosphere to create that cloud. And he used drawing as a way to explore the world around him. And in this process, he created some revolutionary drawing. This drawing is the first scientifically accurate, although there are some mistakes, but it's the first scientific attempt, or it's the first attempt, I should say, to create a scientifically accurate image of a fetus in the womb, in utero, as they say. And this was radical, because to get this drawing, Leonardo da Vinci had to dissect the body of a pregnant woman who died, and this was considered desecration by the Catholic Church. But he was allowed because Leonardo da Vinci was a very famous artist and wielded a lot of influence and had a lot of very powerful friends, and he was allowed to do this. There's all sorts of arguments why, but what's really important is, in many ways, it's his status that allowed him to do this. But the church more or less basically turned a blind eye. But he created lots of drawings where anatomical drawings, very similar to this. He also created engineering schematics, and he would often create these inventions, many of them that he never actually built, even in the form of a model. But he was still using drawing as a way to create, well, in this case, we see a flying machine based on the mechanics of a bird's wing. So, you know, here is one of the sort of fundamental uses of drawing, to explore and to sort of try out new ideas. And here's some other examples I just think are very cool. You can see not only did he study anatomy, of course, studying the musculature of the body and the human skull, although he got things wrong. I could show you this really weird image of a woman's reproductive system that is just bizarre and completely not accurate. But you know, he was trying. But he also invented various other kinds of flying machines, like helicopters. And keep in mind that this is, 500 years before helicopters were invented. And if, in case that helicopter broke down, well, then he also came up with designs for a parachute. His drawings give us a lot of information into his thought processes, into his desire to understand the world around him. Another Renaissance artist and Ninja Turtle, the contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci, who used drawings, was a guy named Raphael. And Raphael would produce what were called cartoons, and these were preliminary drawings used for the creation of frescoes. Frescoes are a kind of painting that uses plaster and pigment. We'll talk about that in the next chapter, but these are very difficult. It's a very difficult material to use for reasons that you will discover. And it dries very quickly is one of the reasons. And so Raphael had to plan everything out beforehand in the form of these large cartoons. And this is, if you look at this is a 9-foot by 26-foot cartoon. And then these cartoons were actually laid on the wall, and then they were traced. So the lines would appear on the wall, so the artist would know where to paint. So he had to lay out everything and plan everything well in advance. And this is, of course, a cartoon for his very famous work, The School of Athens, which we see here, which we'll also talk about later on this semester in more detail. So artists, once again, using drawing as a way to plan out as a sort of a preliminary function when creating a much larger work of art like a painting, a fresco here. Here's another more modern example from the African-American artist John Biggers, who used this pencil drawing in his preparation process, leading to a large mural he did for Burroughs Hall at Penn State School of Education. And so here is the finished work here, in color, using mostly sepia tones, sort of browns. But if you look at the work here, he had everything pretty much already figured out. Once again, you're working on a large scale, and you're getting paid a lot of money by an institution, for example, a college. You don't have time to sort of mess around. And so artists will generally have things completely planned out, much like John Biggers did here and his rather, I think, moving image. And in some ways, I think the drawing might be more successful than the painting, because the drawing, I think, takes advantage of the texture of the charcoal and pencil that he is using to give this work a sort of grittier texture. I think that adds to this feeling of poverty, which this image of the Night of the Poor is trying to convey. The way the paper sort of pushes through, the texture of the paper pushes through the charcoal, I think, or contact crayon, whatever he's using. I'm not sure what material this is, but whatever drawing material he's using, it's really highlighting the texture of the paper itself, creating this rather sort of gritty kind of atmosphere. I think that works incredibly well. So let's talk about drawing materials. There's two basic categories. There's what we call dry media and wet media. And as you can imagine, dry media does not use water, like the stuff you see here, and wet media does. So an artist has to make a choice deciding what they're going to use, dry or wet, and they can use a combination of both. But dry media offer the artist some unique and versatile properties. So let's look at a very old medium called silver point. This was used primarily during the Renaissance, and it's called silver point because it's basically, imagine like a sort of a wooden pen holder with a silver wire in it, sort of like very similar to a mechanical pencil in a way, but there's a silver wire. And silver is a fairly soft metal, and if you rub the silver against a piece of paper, little flakes of the silver will adhere to the paper. And what happens, of course, silver tarnishes over time. So these works actually would get darker over time as the silver tarnished. And what it creates is a very sort of linear, very hard-edged kind of image, as you can see in this Madonna and Child by our good buddy Raphael once again. And as you guys know, if you want to get value, in other words, shading, and create chiaroscuro, oh, don't you love these vocabulary words, in a work of art, then you have to use a combination of hatching or cross-hatching to create different values. And hatching, of course, hatch lines are the lines like you see here, and depending on how far those lines are spaced out from each other, it creates different values of light and dark. Pencil, of course, you're all familiar with pencils. Modern pencils are made with graphite. Traditionally, pencils were made with lead. We don't use lead anymore because lead is poisonous. Lead is what is known as a heavy metal. Your body absorbs it and doesn't get rid of it, and it can poison you. In fact, the Latin word for lead is plumbum, because the Romans used lead in their pipes, and this caused sickness within the Roman Empire, and there are some people who said it even led to infertility and caused a low birth rate crisis that helped contribute to the fall of the Roman Empire. I've heard arguments pro and against that, but it's certainly an interesting little factoid, I think, whether it's true or not. But certainly we get our word plumbing from the Latin word for lead, which is plumbum. Um, but now we use graphite because it's much safer. And graphite is a carbon-based substance. And this has been used for quite some time. Pencils have different degrees of hardness. And the most common pencil that you guys are probably used to using is what's called the 2B, or not to be. That is the question. No, sorry, a little Shakespeare there. But the B stands for black because these pencils are softer. The graphite's softer, meaning that it leaves more of the graphite on the paper when you draw or write with it, making a darker or blacker mark. The harder pencils, the H's, are lighter. And then there's, in between, there's what is called the F, which is a fine point, sort of, pardon the yawn, in between. And so you can see here this artist, Ilka Ghetto, who is using different sorts of pencil hardnesses to create darker and lighter marks. Also, of course, with pencil, you can vary the value of the mark by pressing hard or lighter on the paper, of course. Color pencil is manufactured much like traditional graphite pencil, but it contains some wax in it to hold the pigment together. Pigment just means the material that gives the medium its color. And this is a work by an artist named DJ Hall. It's called Piece of Cake. And DJ Hall is, first of all, is this the most 80s image you've ever seen with the shoulder pads and the mirror shades? I love it. But DJ Hall's work is, I think, rather fascinating because she creates these works that look sort of intimate, like friends or family, but she uses models. And in a way, this is her kind of a clever, ironic way of saying that art is fake, right? Art is artificial. Art is artifice. It is not real. And in fact, images inherently lie to us, as we've already talked about, right? Images don't show us what's really happened. They show us the artist idea of what has happened. They show us an artist vision, and that vision may or may not care about what's real or true, right? So here she creates these images that look sort of like family vacation photos or family birthday photos in this case, and it's a lie. It's not true. But she has a wonderful command of of color pencils. It's hard to believe that this is made with a medium that we all have pretty much access to. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about drawing, don't you guys? The fact that it's something like you just pick up a pen or a pencil and whatever you happen to have lying around, and you grab any old piece of paper and you can create something with very little material. And there's something, to me, very magical about that. In the same way, it's sort of, while hearing somebody sing is really magical, that just with the human voice alone, you could create such beautiful music out of something we all have. I can't do this myself. I'm a terrible singer, but I can yell pretty loud, but that's about it. I was in some punk rock bands back in the day, but this, to me, there's something very magical about the act of drawing, taking something so simple as a pencil and a piece of paper and creating something so complex and beautiful. Dry media, charcoal. Okay, so charcoal is very, very old. We have samples from caves back in France that date to around 30,000 BCE, which is a fancy way of saying BC. We'll talk more about BC and BCE later on, but they mean the same thing. But 30,000 BC, this is old. And charcoal is made from, burnt organic material, typically plant material. The oldest charcoal is made from probably burnt wood, sticks, things like that. It smudges easily. It leaves, you can get really dark darks. You can get almost pure blacks using charcoal. So artists love it, and there's a reason why it's been in use for 30,000 years. However, charcoal is very messy. It does smudge very easily, which makes it kind of difficult to work with sometimes, and it gets everywhere, right? And these are some examples of some charcoal. Charcoal today is commonly made from charcoal powder that is compressed into sticks. But you can still find traditional charcoal. You can buy traditional charcoal sticks. It's known as vine charcoal because it's made from burnt pieces of vine. Traditionally, grapevine is what would have been used. This is a German artist who worked in the 1920s and 1930s named Kate Kollwitz. And Kollwitz is an artist I love. Her work is very dark and both in value. It's literally dark because she often uses charcoal in her drawings and really presses down with charcoal to create these really rich black marks. But also it's very dark oftentimes because her work deals with death, especially since she had a child who died and she suffered painful losses, deaths in her family when she was a child, and a lot of her images are rooted in death. And this is a woman who lived, through a very violent time in world history and European history. So these are major themes in her work, and she uses that darkness of the charcoal to sort of reflect her rather sort of dark, tragic view of humanity. But charcoal, as you can see, can be very versatile. You can get a lot of different value with it. You can get really dark darks, but a lot of lighter grays too, just depending on how hard you press with it, as in this very beautiful image by Leon Augustin Lermite, this charcoal on paper work here. Or we have the work of Zheng Chun Hong called Life Strands, which is a combination of graphite, pencil, and charcoal on paper. And you can see the really, really dark parts would be made with charcoal. As a Chinese artist, she draws heavily from sort of Chinese art history, and she uses these scrolls, much like a lot of ancient Chinese art is on a scroll, and creates these large works that roll out, which I think are really, really cool. The material is chalk and pastel. Chalk is basically, traditional chalk is powdered calcium carbonate and a material called gum arabic. It's a binder. It's a sticky substance. It binds the chalk together. And chalk, of course, is another very old material. It's very similar in charcoal in the fact that it's basically a compressed powder and it can leave really dark marks. Over here we see an image drawn in red chalk by Michelangelo, a study he did for a much larger work. Of course, the very famous Sistine Chapel in Italy, where we have this image here. We'll talk about the Sistine Chapel later on the semester when we get to the Renaissance period. But just like Raphael and Leonardo, in his preparation for these much larger works, he would work out sort of everything in minute detail before he would even put a paintbrush to the wall. He's also, like Raphael, working with this material called fresco, which is, we'll talk about, which is very difficult to work with. So you want to have everything planned out. Pastel is a pigment combined with gum, arabic, wax, or oil. So pastels in some ways are kind of like a greasy or crayon. They're more smeary than a crayon. They're somewhere kind of between chalk and the crayon, depending on how much binder, wax, and gum arabic are in there. So they can be relatively dry like chalk, or they can be sort of more waxy like a crayon, but usually they're sort of somewhere in between. It kind of just depends. But pastels, when we think of pastel colors, we think of like sort of pale, pretty colors like pinks and sky blues and things like that. But pastel is just a term to refer to this medium, this sort of chalky crayon kind of material. And then a crayon, of course, is a pigment mixed with wax. Conte crayon is probably the most common kind of crayon used by artists, but we've all been using crayons our entire life. So this is an example of a chalk, or I'm sorry, I should say a pastel drawing by Edgar Degas. This is, you can see it's done on paper, which typically it's pastel drawings are done on paper. You can see a little bit of the paper, sort of the texture of the paper coming through, and this material by And this work by the Impressionist artist Edgar Degas. Uh, but what I love about pastels is that since it's sort of chalky, it can be blended together like chalk, or you could sort of be linear with it and leave lines. Like, look at the way he's blended the chalk here in this area, but then highlighted certain areas by really just kind of putting these scribbly lines on top of the surface. It's very cool stuff. So crayon, as I was talking about, is uses a wax binder, a pigment in a wax binder, and crayon, of course, is crayons are very, very common. We've been using Crayola crayons, most of us, since we were children. But crayons come in all shapes and sizes. Crayons can come in more kind of a pencil sort of configuration, or they can be sort of sticks, very similar to charcoal or pastel. This is an example of a crayon drawing by Georges Seurat using black Conte crayon. Conte is really just kind of like an artist grade crayon. Erasers and fixatives. So erasers, can be made with natural rubber, which is, of course, an organic natural material coming from the rubber tree, or today we have synthetic erasers, which are more commonly used. Basically, they're kinds of polymers, plastics, right? And erasers, well, they erase. This work here is a rather famous work by the artist Robert Rauschenberg. We saw a work of his earlier, the Texas artist. And Robert Rauschenberg was very much a sort of young guy who wanted to shake up the art world and shock the art world. He often did stuff that sort of confused people. And this, for him, was sort of an anti-drawing. He took a drawing by a guy named de Kooning, Willem de Kooning, who was a very famous abstract expressionist artist. We'll discuss him later. And bought this painting from de Kooning and then erased it and then hung it up as sort of his own, as kind of a remix, or if you will, a variation of this other artist's work. And it was shocking because, some people considered it a desecration of this other artist's work. But de Kooning got it. He got the joke. In some ways, Rauschenberg was being a bit of a troll. This is, excuse my language, but this is a little bit of shit posting, right? I think there's an art in sometimes there's an art in getting people riled up. There's an art of the troll. And certainly the internet did not invent that. And guys like Rauschenberg was doing that, 60 years ago. And there's always been artists like that. There's always artists who love to sort of poke fun at the seriousness of the art world. And that's one of the things Rauschenberg is doing here, is kind of messing with people and sort of skewing some sacred cows, as they say. The opposite of an eraser is a fixative. A fixative is a material that helps the drawing adhere or fix to the drawing surface. You can buy these fixatives at art stores. They can get rather expensive, but most of them are kind of a plastic spray, very similar to sort of a clear varnish that you can spray on the paper to give it a protective coat, so your pencil drawing or charcoal doesn't smear as much. Here's a little tip for you guys who don't want to spend $5-10 on a can of this stuff. Go to the dollar store, buy a can of cheap dollar hairspray, and that stuff works. Oh, my cat decided to join us. Hello, Astrid. Say hi to everybody. Looks like somebody drew her with charcoal, doesn't it? You can't be up there, buddy. You have to be back in my lap, okay? All right. So get some cheap hairspray. It works just as well, and it's way cheaper. You're welcome. Wet media. Okay, so wet media, really what we're talking about here is ink, guys. There's two basic kinds of inks. There's way more than that, but there's two common kinds of inks. There's carbon ink, otherwise known as India ink, which is made from soot. water and gum, binder, sticky. It comes from China, but it's often called India ink because in Europeans, when they first discovered it, they thought it came exclusively from India, so it's called India ink, even though it's from China. Yeah, but it's still probably the most commonly used ink. In Europe, for hundreds and hundreds of years, an ink called gall ink was used. And gall ink is made from these little growths on oak trees that are actually made by wasps. Wasps will lay eggs in an oak bud, and then the oak bud will sort of react to it and form this hard shell around it. And then these can be ground down into a powder, and that powder can be used in an ink. It's really weird stuff. But it's called an oak gall. Sometimes they're called gall apples. And you can see where the little wasp egg and hatched and the larvae crawled out. It's kind of creepy in a way. They're like these little growths on trees. Anyway. There's lots of different ways to put ink down on a page. You can use a brush, a very finely tipped brush. This is very common, especially in Far East Asia, in China and Korea and Japan. There's a long tradition of brush drawings where you take a brush, sometimes usually a really absorbent brush. So traditional brushes are made from hair, animal hair. So you get something that's super absorbent like sable or something like that that can hold a lot of water, and you sort of shape the bristles into a fine point. And there's a very long tradition of these brush drawings that take a lot of skill and a lot of patience to produce, and a lot of precision to produce. And here we have, your book says oak, goat, horse, wolf hair. All, basically absorbent hairs. They use sable too. The thing about brush drawings is that they can almost turn into a painting depending on how much water you add. So here's a work by the French artist Claude Lorraine, just known as Claude. Claude created these beautiful, beautiful atmospheric sort of ink drawings that are almost more like ink paintings because he used a lot of water, creating a more painting-like, less linear, less drawing-like kind of appearance. As far as pens go, traditional pens were made from quills of a bird. They were made basically from a bird feather. Certain species of birds, this sort of shaft, the central shaft of the feather is really quite hard. It's almost like plastic, really. And these ends could be cut and shaped into what is called a nib. And you've seen in old movies, you've seen movies about the American Revolutionary War where you see people drawing with these feathered pens. And really it's just a quill with it's a feather with the end cut. And of course later we see the use of metal nibs to create the same effect, basically. But you'll notice that nibs can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, depending on the kind of mark you want to leave. And here's a really great drawing by Vincent van Gogh, The Sower with Setting Sun, where he has used several different kinds of nibs to create different linear, different line effects. And even some dots, some stippling back here. But he's using different thicknesses and shapes to create a whole variety of stuff, which I think is really cool. You know how I talked about how artists use drawings as a way to prepare for works? They also use, drawings to sort of try out ideas or to just sort of express themselves, almost like a diary. Frida Kahlo, who we've studied already, is an artist who did that. She was an artist who suffered from a car wreck and polio too. She was the poor woman suffered greatly, and this was she would often create these sort of fantastical creatures in her books. And what I love about seeing her drawings is they're a lot looser and freer and than her painting, which is very sort of controlled, I find. But in her drawings, there's a looseness to them that I really, really love. And here we see a combination of several different materials, of pen and ink, of what looks probably like to be crayon, perhaps a colored pencil. But this was a creature that she created called the Ohosoro, or the Isaurus, if you want to translate it into English. And this was a creature she created to represent her pain, these painful operations of many, 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 many that she had throughout her life, which I find fascinating. So let's talk about drawing surfaces. What do artists draw on? Well, the oldest surfaces were probably the dirt, right? We don't have any of those drawings, but our oldest ancestors probably took a stick and started making marks in the dirt. None of that survived. But our oldest drawings come, as I said earlier, from the ancient caves located in Europe. Around 30,000 or so BC are the oldest ones. And they were made with charcoal and other materials, but charcoal is one of the most common. And you take a burnt stick and you scrape it against the wall and you leave a dark mark, as we see here. Other early drawings around 3500 BC, a culture called Sumer emerged in the Middle East, in what is today modern-day Iraq, and they gave us the first written language, or arguably the first written language. Some say the Egyptians invented it first, or they invented it concurrently, whatever. They gave us an early written language, one of the first, if not the first, and they produced their drawings. Actually, the Sumerian writing and drawing is very similar. They used what are called pictograms. They used pictures as for words, to represent words. And they drew them in clay tablets that they would bake. And these would preserve permanent records. And there's still thousands and thousands and thousands of these that have survived. The problem with a wall or a clay tablet is they're really heavy. I mean, walls don't move. Clay tablets are super heavy and cumbersome. So in ancient Egypt, we see the invention of a material called papyrus, made from a plant called the papyrus reed, which grows along the banks of the Nile. And the Egyptians would take these reeds and flatten them and then cut them into strips. And then they would basically lay these strips on top of each other like this and pound and wet them and then pound them together, flatten them out, glue them together into a long scroll that you could, roll up like this, right? And then roll it. Okay, papyrus. Now, there's some problems with papyrus. It's very delicate, temperamental stuff. Papyrus dries out very easily because it's just reeds, right? And so if you don't store it correctly, if you don't store it in an airtight container, it will more or less dissolve. So most of the ancient Egyptian papyrus that has survived has come from airtight environments. It was either sealed in jars and sealed with wax, or it was sealed in a tomb, or it was thrown away and buried under the sand, and then the sand, being an oxygen-free environment, preserved pieces of scrolls that way. And then towards the end of the Roman Empire, around the 5th century AD, we start to see another material come into common use at the beginning of a period we call the Middle Ages. This is called parchment. Sometimes you'll see the term vellum, V-E-L-L-U-M, but we're going to use the term parchment. Some say there's a difference, some say there's not. It doesn't matter. But parchment was used to make manuscripts. Manuscript is a fancy word for a handwritten book. Manus means hand, script means write, to handwritten books. And these books were produced all by hand. There's a video under here you guys are going to watch, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about how manuscripts were created because you're about to see a whole video about it. But these manuscripts could be really quite beautiful, but they were made from a material called parchment, which was made from animal skin. And this animal skin was, it could be, most common would be cattle or sheep, but goat could be used. I mean, really, I mean, I've seen all sorts of, I've seen manuscripts made with rabbit skin. There's even creepily human parchment, but that's gross. It's stretched on a stretcher, and this makes it very thin, almost more like paper than you would think of leather, right? It goes through this special drying and stretching process, creating a very thin material that is rather quite beautiful. And then these books were handwritten. That's why they're called manuscripts. They were handwritten and hand drawn. We use the word illuminated, not illustrated, because oftentimes gold and silver were used on the pages of these books to make them shine, to make them glow, because these were usually holy books, Bibles, or in the Islamic world, a lot of Qurans were produced this way. But they were produced in the Middle Ages in Europe in what was called a scriptorium by monks, medieval monks, men who devote their lives to solitude and to sort of prayer and religious service, would produce these books in special rooms in the monastery where they lived, called a scriptorium. And then the surfaces of these manuscripts were often beautifully designed too, which you will also see in the video. These were very special books, and these were one of a kind. These weren't mass produced. There is no printing press at this point, so each book was singular. And one book could take months or sometimes even years. And if you think about, a monk handwriting out and hand illuminating, hand illustrating a Bible, these were, works of religious devotion, but also they were incredibly expensive and rare to produce, and very difficult to produce, I should say. And then we have paper. Even though paper has been around for a long, long time, since the 1st century AD, in China, it wasn't commonly used in Europe until the printing press was invented in the 1400s. But it was used throughout Asia for centuries and centuries before Europeans commonly used it. Paper is made from wood pulp, and it was invented by a guy in China named Kai Lun around the 1st century AD, or CE. CE means Common Era, so sometimes we use that term. We'll get more into this later on. But he manufactured it from pounded or macerated, sort of ground up plant fibers. And the way it works is you basically have a screen, right? A screen on a frame. And then you have a water filled with mashed up wood pulp. And you have a trough filled up with water and mashed up wood pulp. And then you dip the screen, as you can see this guy here, into it. And the water drains out from the screen, and it leaves the paper on the surface of the screen. And then you let that dry, then you have a piece of paper, right? Pretty cool. That's how paper is produced. And that's it for right now. The next part of this chapter, we're going to be looking at the history of comic books. So I'll see you guys then. All right, bye.